Sweet peace.
So anyway, back to 1983 at Disney. Their big film that bombed in 83 wasn't Tron, it was Something Wicked This Way Comes, which is actually pretty fun, but it comes across too soft, and it lost a fortune. Anyway, that brought about the arrival of Eisner and Katzenberg.
Alright, so we're doing this? We're actually doing this? Woo! God damn, this movie. This movie has been out for 7 years, and it is still talked about. Obscenely. More than I thought it was possible when Man of Steel came out. I remember thinking, God, is Man of Steel the most controversial superhero movie? Boy, was I wrong. It's wild how much passion there is for this movie. It is borderline mental. I'll admit, I was in the mix of that, arguing with friends, strangers on the internet. Fortunately, I grew out of it, and now the conversation's funny. But my God, the conversation rivals a Thanksgiving dinner with family over politics. That's how bad and uncomfortable the conversations can be. Over a comic book movie, for God's sakes. It is fascinating because it speaks to the power of the movie itself. A key thing about the staying power of a movie is if it is worth something talking about after leaving the theater, good or bad. The worst a piece of art can be is just okay, because if you think about it, what's there to talk about? If you love a movie, you're gonna remember it. You're going to talk about it. If you hate a movie, you're gonna remember it. You're gonna talk about it. And for whatever it is worth, Batman v Superman is worth talking about. Okay, let's do this. Cierro miedo. Since the dawn of Marvel's existence, there's been this big joke played on the fans that you need to be in a camp. This competition of who is better, who puts out the better material, DC Comics or Marvel. I foolishly bought into that. I grew up a DC guy and was adamantly against Marvel, except for the X-Men and Spider-Man because they had cartoons I enjoyed. As I grew up, I realized how wrong I was. Marvel puts out some phenomenal comics that have meant the world to me. Same goes for the movies. I'm not touting myself as the biggest MCU fan, but there are gems I adore in and outside of the MCU with the Marvel brand. It's just a different flavor, an alternative, something unique that only they can do. And let's get real, both Marvel and DC steal from each other all the time. Here's the funny thing. Initially, Marvel was an answer to DC Comics. DC Comics were notorious for putting stories that were out of touch with reality and would be larger than life. Stories that were fun, silly, but intangible. Marvel's mission statement was to be somewhat grounded and relatable, at least on an emotional level. Establishing characters that had flaws, dealing with everyday life that couldn't be solved by punching and laughing about it at the end of the day. Now, here's the biggest twist when it came to the MCU establishing itself. It was fun, silly, larger than life with joy and levity. And the DCEU established itself as grounded, gritty, and cynical. Ironically, people ate up Marvel back in the 60s when it was grounded, and they eat up Marvel now when it's joyful. It could be Marvel fans being there at jump and just maintaining loyalty. It could be just as well that Marvel always was ahead of the curve, and just was the alternative that the audience needed from DC. In this modern day, Marvel managed to pull something people have never seen before. A connected universe. Here's something I noticed as a fan of both companies. Marvel's strength has always been serial storytelling. She-Hulk is a series of satirical adventures of a female character existing in the world and the industry that is of comics. Ultimate Spider-Man, in terms of a teenage superhero from his humble beginnings to a beautiful end, in my opinion, it does not get any better than this. Punisher Max, a brilliant examination, a serialized story of a human being that embodies the nature of evil doing necessary evil for what he believes is the greater good. Is it any wonder Marvel was successful at establishing a connected universe? They've been doing that since the beginning. Don't get me wrong, DC has some extraordinary runs in their threshold. But I think it is fair to say, more times than not, they are truly at their peak in the standalone one-off stories. Not to oversell it, but these stories are on another level, that truly elevated comics to a point where these are the examples that are pointed to, that comic books are literature. I think that gave DC some staying power. You don't need to know or read every single Batman comic in existence. I can throw you The Dark Knight Returns and you can read it without any context. I like to think that reflects on their movies, and honestly it's something they should have strived for. In my opinion, I think DC has some strong standalone movies in their roster. But none of that matters. After the Avengers, everything changed. The Avengers drew a line for fans, and that was being fed into. Marvel, criticisms aside, managed to string together 5 movies for the big team-up movie with continuity. And suddenly, everybody looked at WB that next year when Man of Steel came out. Man of Steel arguably can be seen as a standalone movie. It's pretty isolated. But suddenly, plans needed to be drawn. There was a billion-dollar franchise to be had.
Jack, do something!
Right. Once more to the breach, dear friends! Once more! Ready, hold them to.
But the reality was, the damage was done. In the public eye, WB was trailing behind, and they were never going to catch up. It's a shame because Zack, I don't think went into making Man of Steel with the idea of creating a fucking universe from the ground up. But from everything that I've heard, and considering the pressure they had to work fast, the overarching story was intriguing, with a beautiful payoff. But getting there, apparently was too outlandish, as it was immediately created division amongst the fandoms just from Man of Steel alone. I do blame fans as much as I blame knee-jerk reactions from the studio. Instead of trusting that maybe it could work, everything post Batman v Superman was about course correction, and they have been floundering ever since. I will say there was something to Snyder's legacy. BVS made money. It wasn't $1 billion, but it was a hit. So was Suicide Squad, Wonder Woman, and Aquaman. Aquaman was the one to make $1 billion. I do feel there was manhandling as these projects went on, but I think general audiences were into the ideas being implemented and wanted to check them out. It's just fans kept screaming on social media, studios trusted that, and let everything fall into shit. The whole thing saddens me. Between both factions of Marvel and DC, the conversation stopped being about the work itself, but who made more? Who had the better Rotten Tomatoes score? Who has the better creators? The whole thing is so silly. Batman is a character that means a lot to many different people. Throughout his 80 years, there has been multiple variations for different generations of fans, each with their own idea of what Batman should be, me included. Batman is my favorite superhero.
That isn't named Buffy Summers.
He, in his nature, is multifaceted, which is insane to think about. I mean, ideally he should be a straightforward character, a dark Avenger that runs around dressed as a bat. Apparently, there's multiple ways to interpret that.
Such as this.
Batman debuted in Detective Comics number 27 in 1939. Originally, he was written in the traditional style of pulp comics, showing little remorse over killing and maiming criminals. He ran around with a gun, shooting criminals, and even hung them. You know, a straight-up bully. But over the course of his first year existing, he was gaining definition, establishing the touchstone jawline, long bat ears, the utility belt, and bat-themed vehicles like the Batplane, and we get into his origin, the death of his parents. Finally capping it off when he got his sidekick, Robin the Boy Wonder. As the years went on, entering into the 1950s, it started to move away from dark, moody stories and became brighter and more colorful. This is an era of comics I have a strong affinity for. I love Silver Age comics. The Silver Age is basically excellent comedy. Intentional or not, it is phenomenal absurdist material. Wild, bizarre, out there stories that are self-contained with little to no consequence to the overall mythology. Infamously, it's where things like Rainbow Batman came from. Also Batmite, the little imp that is obsessed with Batman. But you also have historical introductions like Batgirl, which was the result of a tie-in to the Batman '66 TV show starring famously Adam West.
Pure West.
If you want to understand how absurd the Silver Age can be, this show takes it on in stride and intelligently leans into it. This was the beginning of how mainstream Batman and comics Batman would share a symbiotic nature, deeply affecting each other. Suddenly, there was a generation that had a strong preconceived notion on Batman's betrayal. The 70s and 80s refocused on Batman as the classic dark brooding Avenger. In the 70s, he very much was sexy adventure man with a hairy chest, but it also told stories that left a strong impact in those 22 pages and experimented with serialized storytelling. You had things like Joker's 5-Way Revenge, the Demon Saga that introduced one of Batman's biggest baddies. But you also had, and this is a personal favorite of mine, Strange Apparitions, a 9-issue arc that scratched the surface of the man in a cape and cowl from a psychological standpoint with such rich emotion. Then in the 80s, two big things happened. Again, a collision of comics Batman and mainstream Batman began to beget each other. The Dark Knight Returns and Batman 89, created by two notable visions. Batman 89 was a palate cleanser of the goofy, campy era of the 60s for a new generation that saw Batman now as the Dark Avenger. The Dark Knight Returns gave an interpretation of Batman that was aggressive, masculine, and borderline insane. There's a lot of conversation if The Dark Knight Returns is what made Batman dark again, when Denny O'Neil, Neil Adams, Steve Englehart, and Marshall Rogers were already building the foundation. Personally, I think it's more accurate to say that Batman walked in the 70s, so Batmania could run rampant in the 80s. Because at the end of the day, everything changed for Batman after these two milestones. It became the norm to start telling hard-hitting stories like The Killing Joke, Arkham Asylum, The Cult, Death in the Family, Son of the Demon. Following suit in the mainstream, we got Batman the Animated Series, which, only rivaled by The Simpsons, is arguably considered one of, if not the best animated series of all time. And to the credit of the work done in the 70s, the animated series was heavily influenced by it, as opposed to being directly influenced by The Dark Knight Returns or Batman 89. From that point on, Batman got pigeonholed into different interpretations that people ended up becoming increasingly beholden to, and you could find several comics, TV shows, or movies to support it. My personal preference of Batman is a man who is in pain and blames himself for something that was completely out of his control. A man that tries to rise above the pain and build a family, and like a parent should do, ensuring their kids wouldn't endure the pain they have experienced. A man who is working on trying to find happiness and love. And I'll be honest, I do like my Batman a little spicy, whether that means he's a straight up psycho or a flat out dick, but the smarter writers know how to navigate that story and tell very powerful stories with humility. And it's all valid. Batman is a psychopath, and there is evidence to support that. But that is just as valid as Batman is a goofball who likes to dance. And nobody is wrong, there is no correct version per se. Batman was all these things for a solid amount of time for each era. Most comic book characters are not going to retain consistency. It's bananas to believe otherwise. Yes, there are core fundamentals, but the fun of art is the multiple interpretations and iterations. Batman has existed for 80 years with different shades of flamboyancy and masculinity, and I love them all. That summer of 2013, the public was watching as we anticipated what Warner Bros. Was going to do with their characters. Instead of a straight-up Man of Steel sequel, we get a crossover movie between Superman and Batman, and they're fighting each other. At this point, I was still trepidatious of Zack Snyder, not only directing again, but now he was handling the entire DC universe. In 2016, it was a double whammy of Batman v Superman and Suicide Squad. I was excited for both, but at the time, I swore up and down based on that first Comic-Con trailer of Suicide Squad that was going to be the introspective, character-driven film, and BVS was going to be the fun, dumb action film. Boy, was I wrong. I did not expect what this movie was offering, that it would be so complicated emotionally, character-driven, and actually gives an examination of who these characters are and what they represent. This is the movie that not only made me a Zack Snyder fan, but someone I actually look forward to watching in the future. I'm not gonna lie, initially I was bummed it wasn't a straight-up Man of Steel sequel. But that summer of 2013, they announced who was playing Batman, and I'm going to be that guy that said I believed in Ben Affleck from the get-go. Batman. That to me is brilliant casting. That was a dream come true that I didn't even realize I wanted. I will argue he is the best damn thing about the movie, and low-key, he is my favorite Batman. God damn, Ben was everything I dreamed of when I would read Batman. I mean the suit. Look at the suit. Someone finally gave Batman a gray suit. I love the details of it being scratched up, that the bottom of his cape is dirty and messed up. I mean, look. The short bat ears and the resting angry face on the mask? His physique? His jawline? The voice modulator?
I'm real when it's useful.
So much of it sells the age and jaded nature of Batman, and it's brilliant. All of it, it's so perfect to me. So now that this was the second movie out the gate, and they had a universe to build, it acts sort of as a backdoor entryway for these characters without establishing them in their own movies. A lot of people had problems with this. Honestly, that never bothered me, especially what the end result was, which was basically found footage cameos. And then the next movie was the team up. Maybe this is my movie brain, but I feel like you can do effective character-driven stories in one movie as opposed to having a movie for each individual character. Like, what exactly do the audience need to know outside of their power sets that they can't learn in a later movie? In my opinion, what they did with Wonder Woman was fascinating as she slinks around acting mysterious and then shows up in full costume for the best shot of the movie. And this introduction with little tidbits, little insight that creates this intrigue, it made me anxious to see her movie for the full backstory. To me, that is such a comic book thing to do. It's fair to say anybody that has ever read a comic was dropped into a story with characters they were not familiar with. And you come across a character that strikes you with so much intrigue you're compelled to do more research by reading more comics. I just never understood the argument that we needed more movies to get to know these characters. I would bet most people were introduced to the MCU through the first Avengers movies, and had to go backwards to get to know the characters. People were against this movie before it was even released. I think the amount of effort that people willingly overlooked spoke volumes to why it resonated with the fan base that spawned from this movie. A constant complaint I see surrounding this movie is usually a laser focus on these three characters: Batman, Superman, and Lex Luthor. A lot of it has to do with the characterization. Most of it has to do with the plot and their individual arcs. So what I want to do is venture through and break down these individual arcs by their beats. Because I do think these arcs work. I know part of the confusion was the simple fact that the theatrical cut is the one that general audiences have seen, which is literally 75% of the movie. The ultimate cut isn't really a director's cut as much as it's the movie in its entirety. The 30 minutes cut from the theatrical makes a world of difference in that it has truly crucial information and plot elements, character beats that otherwise felt rushed or incomprehensible. First, let's start with Superman. Superman starts in a very interesting place post Man of Steel. He has this I don't care attitude when it comes to the press.
They're saying...
I don't care. I don't care what they're saying.
He keeps trying to do his best, but somehow, some way, the world always finds a way to be against him. This creates an aggressive, nihilistic behavior from his first scene throughout a lot of the movie, and it does become a behavior he regrets. We have our classic setup of Lois Lane is on an assignment, things go sideways, and she's held hostage. Superman shows up and plows through the Warlord. Which, I'll admit, it's a bit off-putting because it's so casual and it plays off like a joke. Despite that, he is motivated by his love for Lois. She is the only thing he is certain about because despite how much he saves the world, his actions will always be under scrutiny. His attention then turns over to the Bat of Gotham, learning about Batman's escalated new method of crime fighting, branding criminals and such. It is interesting to note that while Bruce focuses his efforts to stop Superman as Batman, Clark focuses on stopping the Bat as a reporter. He is then invited to Luthor's party and puts a face to who Batman is. Then, a criminal that was branded by Batman is shanked while in prison, presumably because of being branded. This triggers Clark to do something more aggressive as he realizes he might need to intimidate Batman as Superman. I always thought this scene was funny in a deeply dry kind of way, simply because Clark tries to be tough and Bruce sees right through it, hence the infamous line,
Tell me. Do you bleed?
Clark then hits his midpoint as he goes to Capitol Hill and is the only survivor of the explosion, and probably the best shot in the entire film. He then blames himself as he believes his callousness is what caused him not to look for the bomb that was placed. As he goes on a journey to discover himself again, he imagines what Pa Kent would say, remembering a story about his father's failure after believing he won. From there, Clark's mother is used as leverage over him to not only fight Batman, but to kill him. Clark tries to reason with him, trying to show that if he wanted to, he could kill Bruce. as he does infamously reach Bruce with a plea for mercy, begging for his mother's life. We then get his denouement, where Superman realizes that the world is worth fighting for, because the woman that he loves is in it. He sacrifices himself, becoming the hero that everyone took for granted. Next, let's take a look at Batfleck's arc. Well, he's a jaded Batman that takes pills with wine. He lost a Robin and became incredibly callous, believing his war on crime is fruitless. That all speaks volumes from certain lines.
We're criminals, Alfred. We've always been criminals. Nothing's changed.
To his obvious actions, like branding criminals or flat out letting them die. To note, I'm saying letting, which is very, very different from murdering. I'm making the argument he simply doesn't care anymore and chooses not to be careful. Which, let's be real, at least it's something compared to anything Keaton, Kilmer, or Bale have done. At least there can be an argument made for a story reason, as opposed to just Batman being hypocritical. Ultimately, this Batman doesn't think much of himself. He witnesses something horrific in the Battle of Metropolis and blames Superman for it. Honestly, that's kind of fair. Considering the rough reaction people had to Man of Steel and that sequence, it's smart to have Batman reflect that. Now, there's meaning for his war on crime. He projects his crusade onto killing Superman, thinking that maybe if he kills Superman, the whole thing will be worth it. And he's manipulated by Luthor throughout the movie to push that desire. He has a dream that he misinterprets, which, by the way, it sucks we won't get to see the payoff for because it was such a clever idea. He hits his low point as he sees yet another tragedy that he blames Superman for. This pushes him right into Luthor's hands as he steals the kryptonite and prepares for battle. We get to the big showdown, and throughout the whole fight, Batman amps himself up by dehumanizing Superman.
That's fear. You're not brave. Men are brave. You were never a god. You were never even a man.
Making it easier for him to actually murder somebody. And then we hit the pivotal turn, the controversial Martha scene. It never bothered me, but I get it. It's one of those moments that I do get swept up into emotionally, and even though
Why did you say that name?
it gets parodied to hell, I do like Affleck's performance. It's strong. For better or worse, this moment isn't about their moms sharing the same name. It's Bruce realizing Clark is a man begging for his mother's life, and Bruce comes back down to reality. So then he races to go save Martha, someone he couldn't save when he was a little boy. Echoing a Batman I like, one who blames himself for something that wasn't even his fault. We then hit the denouement where Superman sacrifices himself for humanity, and Batman realizes how wrong he was. He realizes, like the rest of the world, Superman was taken for granted. This creates a fundamental change in Batman, where he finds meaning in the work again and wants to be better. He wants to find the others to form the Justice League because he starts to believe the world can be better. And that's punctuated in his scene with Luthor. Instead of branding him like the old vengeful him would have done, he punches the wall. And finally we have...
The red capes are coming. The red capes are coming.
So here's my confession. I love Jesse Eisenberg in this role. I know, that's unpopular, but I already committed to making this video, which in itself is unpopular, so I am a sucker for big, unapologetic performances. Not always.
This is not how this was supposed to go.
There's something to it when an actor just doesn't give a fuck and goes all in. This man made some choices, and I support it. He isn't my favorite Luthor, but I do respect what they were going for, and I do think it was suitable for this film. At the start of the movie, there's a lot happening that are all parts of Luthor's plans. Things are already in motion before we even see him, which is like 20 minutes into the film. Luthor knows who Batman and Superman are, and wants one of two things. Ultimately, he wants to kill Superman and the metahuman threat. He wants to create deterrence to face off these metahuman threats that gets rejected by a state senator. He manipulates Batman and Superman to fight each other. If Batman wins, Luthor wins. But if Superman wins, Luthor still wins because it serves his other purpose, which is to defame the Man of Steel. Why does he want to do this? Well, it's sprinkled throughout the movie. He resents the idea of Superman.
Yes, Superman.
He talks endlessly about his inferiority complex, that his intelligence has become irrelevant because someone like Superman exists.
The bittersweet pain among men is having knowledge with no power, because that is paradoxical, and thank you for coming.
He sets out to prove that if Superman is a god, he can't be all good, because if he was all good, he can't be all powerful.
I figured out way back. If God is all powerful, he cannot be all good. And if he is all good, then he cannot be all powerful. And neither can you be.
Believing in this idea that power corrupts because that's how he views himself. Luthor uses Wally's tragedy against Bruce. He intercepts Wally from getting his checks that Bruce has been sending, building not only a resentment towards Bruce Wayne for feeling abandoned, but resenting Superman for ending up this way, priming him to be Luthor's human bomb when he's offered
to help you stand for something.
In Africa, Luthor arranges for Lois to score that interview and creates an incident where her interview turns hostile because of Luthor's plant, the KG Beast. KG Beast kills everyone, piling the bodies and burns the corpses, making it look like Superman used his heat vision. Luthor dangles the carrot for Bruce to chase down the white Portuguese, while he also sends Clark on his way to investigate the Batman. Luthor invites both of them to his party so they can meet face to face. Interesting thing to note, Luthor knows exactly who Clark is, despite the fact that this is their first scene together. Luthor then orchestrates for the criminal that was branded by Batman to be shanked. Then the midpoint is the Capitol Hill explosion killing everyone, including the senator that was blocking his request to use kryptonite as a weapon deterrent, using Wally's chair to be lined with lead, knowing Superman couldn't see it. Luthor's plan starts to come together as the Bat immediately breaks into LexCorp to steal the kryptonite. He gains access to the Kryptonian ship to learn about Krypton's history and creates his contingency plan, another deterrent. Everything starts to fall into place as Luthor has the world in his hands. He primed Batman to fight and has an incentive for Superman to fight as he kidnaps his mother.
And now God bends to my will.
Despite the two not killing each other, Luthor unleashes his deterrent in that of Doomsday and successfully kills Superman, but turned him into a martyr.
You've lost.
I don't know how to lose.
You'll learn.
I'll learn.
The funny thing is, he learns that he's a lot more insignificant than he realized, as he learns about the new gods, but at least...
Ding dong. The god is dead.
So after breaking everything down, I do think Clark has the weakest arc. He just kind of wallows, he's angsty and kind of directionless. It's unfortunate because I do see Batman v Superman as a Superman movie. Everything in the movie is about him. There isn't a strong idea of what exactly Clark wants, though. There can be arguments made for him trying to figure out what the right thing to do is, but it's a little short-sighted and somewhat of a retread to something that was stronger in Man of Steel. Unfortunately, that is the drawback of trying to juggle 3 characters with 3 major arcs, one more elaborate than the last. It sucks Clark gets the short end, but it does suck less because he had his own movie previous. I think that's why the focus is more on Bruce, who I think has the best and strongest arc. He's the one that goes through the most dramatic beats. You can break down his arc understandably beat by beat and actually see his emotional journey. He has a strong establishment of where he is emotionally and mentally to where he ends up. People don't have to like it, that's fine, but there is a foundation there. The whole thing with criminals dying isn't exactly for no reason. There is something there, which is more than we often get. Luthor has the most elaborate arc. It's complicated. Not everything is spoon-fed, some of it is a blink and you'll miss it kind of moment, and you have to kind of keep a lot of things straight as the story unfolds. Which I guess can be argued why it feels incoherent and unfocused. When in reality, the movie does some things to hold your hand, and other times it's denser than a steel wall. To be honest, I respect the hell out of that. And there you have it, my big, ambitious video on Batman v Superman, like the movie itself. I get that it's unconventional. I will always be drawn to movies that are ambitious, that are unconventional. Hell, when it's a comic book movie, that's when it's exciting. That's a unique experience. I get the perception of it feeling messy. I don't see it as being messy. To me, it does make sense when I actually sit down and think about it. I like stories that challenge me, that gives me more credit than I probably deserve to figure out what is happening. It's pretty bold of a major blockbuster to go against the grain like that. To toe this line of when to be obvious and when not to be obvious. And it's tough. At the end of the day, you don't want audiences to see things coming a mile away, but you don't want to be so dense it's unapproachable. This movie does a decent job of that. Some things are spoon-fed, but some things you have to make sense of it for yourself. The sheer audacity of even doing that, though, that gets more leeway and admiration from me than not even trying at all. It does sadden me that there was such a major blowback against this movie, and it made people so confrontational over a comic book movie. But on the other hand, the fact that it is something worth talking about even years later, that says a lot more about what the power of storytelling can do.